Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens. So, Our Mutual Friend was Charles Dickens's 14th published novel, and I reread it in August and September. I was rereading it for the mega Dickens Readalong, which is a 2-year read-along that has been going on for the last 2 years that is now very sadly over. And a group of us have been reading Charles Dickens's novels in publication order, finishing up with The Mystery of Edwin Drood, his final unfinished novel, which he wrote after Our Mutual Friend. I will be putting up a video about Our Mutual Friend hopefully later this week. And in fact, this is going to be a pretty Dickens heavy week here on Books and Things because I also want to do a mega Dickens ranking where I tier rank all of Dickens's books by various categories. I have made my categories and my tier ranking like spreadsheet thingy on Canva, and it's gonna take me a long time. I'm sorry that this video is late. Life has got away from me in the last month or two. There will be some spoilers at some point in this video, but I will let you know when the spoilers are coming, and the first half-ish of this video will be spoiler-free. So before I get into everything else, let me talk a little bit about the premise of Our Mutual Friend. It is a wonderful, very long novel with many plots and subplots in it and a lot of different characters, but a lot of the action kind of revolves around this great fortune that has been made through rubbish and dust, through the collection and sorting of rubbish and dust. And before this book begins, the man who has amassed this fortune in rubbish and dust dies, leaving his fortune to his only son, his only child, on the condition that the son marry a woman who he has never met. The son is journeying back from England, but rather than arriving at his lawyer's office as he is meant to, he is instead found drowned in the River Thames. And then we follow what happens to this fortune afterwards and to all of the people who are connected to it. We follow the lawyer who was dealing with the will and a friend of his. We follow the woman who this John Harmon, who's been found drowned, was meant to marry. We follow Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, the servants of old Mr. Harmon, who end up inheriting the fortune. We follow the man and his daughter who pulled the dead body out of the river, and we follow various other characters who are all kind of tied together by this central thread. So my general thoughts about Our Mutual Friend. I mean, this is my favourite book of all time. And it always will be. Like, this has been my favourite book since I was 13, and I just don't think another book would ever beat it, because even if I read a book that I thought was better, which, you know, like, I probably have done, but no book will ever top my, like, emotional attachment to this book. Like, this is my favourite novel, and I'm so emotionally attached to it, and I love it so much that I just don't think anything could ever replace it. It was also the first book I read by my absolute favourite author, and was like one of the books that sort of sparked my love of Victorian literature. I've read it so many times and I love it so much, and it is, you know, Dickens's last finished novel. I feel like it really is a culmination of all of his books and all of his talents, and I just feel like nothing could ever beat it for me because it is the best. I think this is my 8th time reading Our Mutual Friend. I think I've now read 8 times. I might be wrong in that number because I didn't keep count of how many times I read books in the same way that I do now until I was maybe like 21, 22, and as I said, I first read it when I was 13. This time I listened to the audiobook narrated by Mira Sial, which I have listened to once before, and it is a really good audiobook. It was a pleasure to listen to it on audiobook. It's always a pleasure to experience Our Mutual Friend in any way, and it is just the best, and I love it so much. I want to talk a bit about chronology, as I have been doing in all of these videos. It's always really interesting to look at kind of how Dickens's novels changed and progressed over time, and obviously this is Dickens's last finished novel. And like I said, I really do think it is a culmination of like all of Dickens's talent. Like, the atmosphere is amazing, the characterization, the plot, the humour, the balance of the humour and the emotional stuff, the wonderful female characters, you know. Whenever people say that Dickens can't write women, I just think, like, go and read Our Mutual Friend and encounter Lizzie Hexam. Like, I know that the female characters in, like, the Pickwick Papers and Nicholas Nickleby are so boring, and I feel like so many of the female characters in like the early half of Dickens are just like cardboard cutouts, but by the time you get to Our Mutual Friend, that's just not true at all. And it also has so many like wonderful, wild, eccentric Dickensian characters who work so well. Like, it's such a Dickensian book, and the balance of the humour and the emotion and the gritty stuff is so well done. I think it's really interesting to look at it as like coming after Great Expectations, because I think a lot of the themes and the atmosphere and like everything around the River Thames kind of starts in Great Expectations. Like the River Thames is quite important in Great Expectations too, and a lot of the themes and atmosphere from that book kind of seep into Our Mutual Friend as well. We also have this kind of complex sibling relationship between Lizzie and Charlie Hexam, with, you know, good sister and not so good brother, which you've kind of seen in previous books like Little Dorrit and Hard Times. It's got a slightly different dynamic in Our Mutual Friend, but I feel like you can see the seeds of that earlier as well. And I also think a character like Eugene Wrayburn feels very much like the natural successor to characters like James Harthouse in Hard Times and Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities. And I think he's like the culmination of that character type, maybe. I don't know. Sidney Carton is great as well, but like Sidney Carton is like the bright spot in a otherwise medium book as far as I'm concerned. Tale of Two Cities is not my favourite, whereas Eugene Wrayburn is like a bright spot in a sea of bright spots. What a great book it is. It's also interesting to think about Our Mutual Friend being like before Edwin Drood, which we'll talk a bit more about in my Edwin Drood video, but I think there are quite a few elements from Our Mutual Friend that kind of carry on into the mystery of Edwin Drood, and there are two plot lines especially. Thinking about like Bradley Headstone's plot line in Our Mutual Friend, and also Bella and John Harmon's like odd engagement in Our Mutual Friend. You know, the fact that Bella has been like left in a will to this man who's supposed to come back from overseas to marry her, but actually is found drowned, like that sort of reminds me of the setup of the mystery of Edwin Drood, where we have this young man and this young woman who have been engaged for a long time, whose parents basically like really wanted them to get married and said so in their wills, but they're not necessarily as sure about it, and then Edwin disappears. Like that kind of feels related to Our Mutual Friend, or maybe like inspired by Our Mutual Friend in a way, so that's kind of interesting. And I've already spoken a bit in this video about kind of gender and how that changes over time in Dickens's books. This is a particular interest of mine. It's what I did my dissertation on at university, and yeah, I just find gender in Dickens fascinating, and I feel like if you compare a book like Our Mutual Friend with his early works, like there's just no comparison in terms of like the complexities with which gender roles and like gender power dynamics are examined, but also just like, I mean, all of his characterization is a lot deeper, but especially the characterization of his female characters changes so much from early books to late books, and the women go from being really boring, beautiful cardboard cutouts to like actually interesting people, and Lizzie Hexam is just like the absolute best. I love Our Mutual Friend a lot, and I have often thought like, oh, who's the main character of Our Mutual Friend? You know, John Rokesmith is obviously very important, Bella Wilfer and Lizzie Hexam are very, very important. And then recently I saw a really wonderful stage adaptation on the National Theatre, The London Tide. It's finished now, but I think you can access it online somewhere. I'll have a look and leave some links down below if so. But London Tide was this wonderful adaptation of Our Mutual Friend. And you know, it's quite hard to adapt an 1,000-page book into sort of a 3-hour show, or less than 3-hour show. Basically what they did, which I thought was actually a really good plan, a really good idea, was they just took like 2 threads and they took out everything else. And they took out quite a lot that I would have thought of as maybe being the main plot, but actually it kind of made me reevaluate what is the central plot and who are the central characters in Our Mutual Friend. And London Tide really focused on Lizzie Hexam a lot, like it was Lizzie's story, really. And I have always thought that Our Mutual Friend, like Lizzie, is one of the main characters, but I hadn't really thought of it as Lizzie's story until I saw London Tide, and then I was like, actually, yes, I understand it's an adaptation and you're just taking like certain elements, but actually the way it focused in on certain elements also made me reevaluate like what are the most central core elements to Our Mutual Friend, and it made me think about how amazing Lizzie is as a character and how amazing her journey is. London Tide was amazing. It was so good to see like a stage adaptation of my favourite book that is, you know, underrated. There are a lot of books I love that are a lot more underrated than Our Mutual Friend. It is one of those Dickens books that I think most people who have read it love it. Like it's a big Dickens fan favourite, I would say, but it's not Dickens's best known book, and it should be because it is the best. Anyway, that was a really long tangent. I also wanted to talk a bit in the chronology section about Mr. Ryer as a character, because Mr. Ryer is quite interesting. Way back when we read Oliver Twist, which was Dickens's second novel, we encountered the character of Fagin. And Fagin is sort of well known as a character, and he's also quite well known for being quite an anti-Semitic portrayal of a Jewish character. Like, there's definitely a lot of anti-Semitism and Victorian stereotyping, like, bound up in the character of Fagin. And Dickens received complaints about this at the time, both from the public and from people who he knew personally, and he apologised at the time, and kind of later editions of Oliver Twist kind of mentioned the fact that Fagin is Jewish a little bit less than the original one. But anyway, Mr. Ryer in Our Mutual Friend is also Jewish, and Mr. Ryer is a very good, kind person who is treated very badly and with a lot of prejudice by a lot of people around him. And I feel like Mr. Ryer is there as an apology for Fagin. It's not just that Mr. Ryer is a really good person, but also that Mr. Ryer suffers from a lot of prejudice and fights back against some of the prejudice he received. So I feel like you can see Dickens trying to critique anti-Semitism through the character of Mr. Ryer. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to look at in terms of chronology with Our Mutual Friend as well. So next I want to talk a bit about the plot. In general, I think the plot of Our Mutual Friend is really, really great. I think the premise and like everything around the death of John Harmon, the will and the money and how it affects many people, like all of that stuff is fascinating. The intrigue around the death works so well, and also the intrigue around kind of Mr. Wegg and that plot line I think is good too. And I also really like the love stories in Our Mutual Friend. I think they work really well for me. I also feel like Bradley Headstone and his subplot is like the best thing Dickens ever wrote. Like, I just think that plotline is so good. Our Mutual Friend also has like the Dickens plot structure I love the best, where it's like a really long book with a lot of different plot threads like twisting and weaving together in the most amazing way, and I love that. And there's so many like little links between different plot lines. You know, the subplots don't really stand on their own, they all kind of like weave into one another, and I just love that a lot. There is one plot element in the second half that I don't know that it works as well as everything else in the book, and it is slightly annoying, but I also just kind of don't care. Like, I feel like I made my peace with it long ago, and I love this book so much that it kind of doesn't impact my love of the book. I know that a few people stumbled over that plot point who are reading along with the Mega Dickens Readalong, and I totally understand why, but I also feel like it is a small, like, flaw, potentially, in, like, what is otherwise the greatest book ever, in my opinion. So yeah, I don't know. Anyway, I also wanted to talk briefly about kind of the atmosphere and the setting, because I feel like Our Mutual Friend is such an atmospheric book, and everything around kind of the River Thames and like the dust heaps and the contrast between like the grimy stuff and the sort of polished society of Podsnappery, like I feel like all of that stuff is done really well, and the exploration of London and like the look at London as a place, and all these people who kind of like surround the River Thames, like I feel like that stuff is amazing as well. The characterization in Our Mutual Friend is so good. Like, it contains, I think, my three favourite characters in all of literature. Like, Jenny Wren, Lizzie Hexam and Bradley Headstone I think are Dickens's best characters. They are so well drawn and amazing. Lizzie Hexam, as I said, is I think like Dickens's most interesting heroine. She has a fascinating arc. I really love her as a character. She's both emotionally and physically strong, and her storyline works so well. Jenny Wren is just amazing. She is my favourite like Dickens eccentric, but I also think she's just an amazing character in her own right. This young like teenage girl who runs her own business, and like the way Dickens looks at disability through her is really interesting as well. And Jenny Wren is just like wonderful. Like, everything she says and everything she does and every like moment with Jenny Wren is just the greatest. Like, I just don't think there is any character in all of literature that I love as much as Jenny Wren. And then Bradley Headstone, I don't know how much I can say about him because he doesn't come in until a little bit later in the story, but I feel like he is so superbly drawn. And then there are so many other wonderful characters. You know, I find Eugene Wrayburn a really interesting character. This man who sort of doesn't understand himself, who is very bored and languid, and then suddenly there's one thing in life that interests him, but he doesn't really understand his own feelings. It's so well done. I really like Bella Wilfer as a character. I think she's really enjoyable, and like her father, Mr. Wilfer, and the whole Wilfer family are so fun to read about. Like, every chapter with the Wilfer family is just pure joy and entertainment in Our Mutual Friend. It's so great. I think Mr. Rokesmith is a really interesting character. Mr. and Mrs. Boffin are so interesting. Betty Higden I really like. I think she's a really wonderful character. Miss Abby Potterson and the kind of villainous characters, you know, Rogue Riderhood, Mr. Wegg, I think they're really interesting. Mr. Venus I really like. I think Gaffer Hexam and Charlie Hexam are well drawn. I find the Lamleys or the Lamels, I'm never quite sure how to say it. The audiobook I was listening to most recently called them the Lamels, but the adaptation from the 90s called them the Lamleys. So in my head, they've always been the Lamleys until I was listening to the audiobook, and now I think I'm just gonna alternate with what I call them. The Lamleys, the Lamels, whoever they are very interestingly done as characters, and they are so like slimy, but really interesting. Although, you know, coming back to Dickens and gender, I do feel like you can tell Dickens's thoughts on morality and women, where he's like, here are two people who are both kind of horrible fortune hunters, but obviously the woman is less horrible than the man, because we all know women are responsible for morality. Maybe I need to do a video talking about like the Victorian obsession with women being like of great moral purity, and therefore, you know, all sin being their fault, because they should be upholding morality. Maybe I need to make a video about that at some point, because, you know, fascinating, unpleasant theory throughout the Victorian period that Dickens, even when he creates amazing characters like Lizzie Hexam, never quite escapes. Anyway, I love Fascination Fledgeby. What a wacky, weird character. I love Sloppy. Sloppy has my heart. What a lovely character. Mr. Podsnap is so interesting. And Mr. Podsnap, I think, is a great example of one of those Dickensian eccentrics who is completely a caricature, but also is an exaggerated type of a kind of person that really exists. You know, that bit where Mr. Podsnap is at that party and he's just like talking English really loudly and really slowly and like correcting everything the other man says. And I feel like even today we have all met people like Mr. Podsnap. There are just so many fantastically drawn characters in Our Mutual Friend, and that is one of many, many reasons why I love it so much. So moving on to the themes within Our Mutual Friend, this book has a lot of really interesting themes. As I have mentioned a few times in this video, I do find the way Our Mutual Friend looks at gender really interesting. I'll talk more about this in the spoilery section, but I do think that Our Mutual Friend has some of Dickens's best female characters, not just Lizzie Hexam, but also characters like Jenny Wren, Betty Higden, Abby Potterson are all really interesting and really complex. And also those four characters all like live and work independently, and they work to support themselves, not just to support their families. And I don't think I can like emphasize how much that is a shift from early Dickens books. Like, you just don't see those kind of female figures working and earning their own living in early Dickens books in the way that you do in Our Mutual Friend, and that's really cool. I also really like Bella Wilfer as a character. I don't adore everything about her arc, but I do think she's a really interesting character, and I really like her. I feel like she's a lot more complex than similar characters you see in early Dickens books. Like, I think there's probably some things in common between like Dolly Varden in Barnaby Rudge and Bella Wilfer in Our Mutual Friend, but Bella Wilfer is a much more complicated figure. And I also feel like there's a lot of interesting look at masculinity in Our Mutual Friend too, through characters like Eugene Wrayburn, Bradley Headstone, Fascination Fledgeby, Mr. Lamley, and quite like different looks at different kinds of masculinity is something that's also very interesting here. I also think that the way class, money, and social mobility are looked at in Our Mutual Friend is really, really interesting. You know, from the very beginning of the book, we have this connection between money and rubbish. We have this giant fortune that has been made literally through sifting from dust and rubbish. And we also have a lot of other characters who kind of have made their money through dubious means. You know, Gaffer Hexam and Rogue Riderhood make their money by taking dead bodies from the Thames, stealing the money from the pockets of these dead people, and handing the dead bodies into the police, presumably for some kind of reward. Like, what a grim way to make your living. And this kind of connection between money and death and money and rubbish and decay really seeps through the whole of Our Mutual Friend in a really interesting way. And we also have this kind of theme of like the corrupting power of money. Another interesting kind of way money and social mobility are looked at in Our Mutual Friend is the way it kind of focuses on the difference between having money and having class. So Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, when they inherit the fortune, they are, you know, lower class people. They are servants who are suddenly raised to being like the richest people in the neighbourhood, but they're not considered to be quite on equal terms with everybody else in society because they have the money but they don't have the class. Bella Wilfer is another interesting character in terms of social mobility, but she's from a very lower middle class background, and when the Boffins kind of adopt her, she ends up again in this world of fashion that is very new to her, and it's interesting to look at kind of her role within society. I also feel like the Lamleys are quite interesting to look at as kind of the flip side of Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, because the Lamleys, they have the class and the birth and the manners of society, but they have no money whatsoever, and you know, therefore they have to beg, borrow or steal it. And talking of social mobility, we also have kind of both Charlie Hexam and also Bradley Headstone kind of talk a lot about like raising themselves. Bradley Headstone is a teacher, but he's from a very lower class background. Charlie Hexam, Lizzie's brother, from a very lower class background, training to be a teacher throughout quite a lot of the book. And you can see both Charlie and Bradley's efforts to build a better life for themselves and a more respectable life for themselves. And of course, talking of class, the kind of big class divide and massive gulf between Lizzie Hexam and Eugene Wrayburn is a really kind of important central part of the plot. Kind of leading on from that, I want to talk a bit about like society, reputation and respectability within Our Mutual Friend. There are quite a few chapters where we get like the voice of society, where we have, you know, various people at a dinner party talking about things. And it's quite interesting to see how, you know, the Veneerings and the Podsnaps and these characters kind of present the voice of society, but also like they're all massive hypocrites. Like Dickens makes it very clear that it's all kind of false and fake. You know, we have Mr. Tremolow's like great concern over who Mr. Veneering's oldest friend is, because Mr. Veneering, you know, wants to get on in society and is a bit of a social climber. You know, everything about him and his wife is brand new, we're told from the very beginning. We don't know that much about Mr. Veneering's background, but the suggestion is that perhaps he is a bit more in the new money world than he would like everyone to believe. Mr. Tremolow finds it very stressful and socially awkward that he doesn't know whether or not he's Mr. Veneering's best and oldest friend, because every person Mr. Veneering meets, he declares is his oldest friend, and poor Mr. Tremolow finds it very upsetting, which I really, really like. I forgot to talk about him when I was thinking about characters earlier, but I feel like Mr. Tremolow is a really random character. On the one hand, he doesn't have that big a role in the book, and you could lose him, you know, if you were adapting Our Mutual Friend to screen or stage or whatever, you don't need to have Mr. Tremolow. But I love Mr. Tremolow, and I also really identify with his like social stress whenever he's at parties and he's like, I just don't know what my position is in this party. How well do I know the host? I just don't know. Anyway, that was a tangent. But I find like the look at Podsnappery and the Veneerings and kind of all of that society stuff and the like hypocrisy and falseness of it, that's really, really interesting. And we see kind of the same with the Lamleys, you know, always trying to keep up appearances and pretend that they're a lot wealthier than they are. And I also feel like this kind of ties in with looks at respectability and reputation sort of further down the social scale. So we have a character like Bradley Headstone who is very, very respectable and who is obsessed with keeping his respectability and obsessed with being a respectable person and having brought himself from lower origins to being respectable. And that is kind of a key part of his personality, and I find that really interesting too. I think that's all I want to say that is spoiler free, so I'm going to move on to some spoilery stuff now. If you haven't read the book, please do head off now and I will carry on talking about Our Mutual Friend with many spoilers. I wanted to return to sort of money, class, respectability, all of that stuff, because I feel like the theme of the corrupting influence of money is really important in Our Mutual Friend, but obviously it is slightly undercut in the second half when we find out that Mr. Boffin has not actually been spoiled by his fortune and was just pretending. I get that that's the plot point that a lot of people struggle with, and I've sort of made my peace with it, and I kind of feel like it's fine. Like, it makes me think of, you know, a slightly like silly Shakespearean comedy moment where things are revealed to not be what they seem, and I sort of just, you know, go with it because it's Dickens and I love him. But that does potentially like undercut the theme of the corrupting influence of money. But I guess we do see how other characters are sort of worsened by their desire for money. People like Mr. Wegg, you know, the Lamleys, Mr. Fledgeby, Bella as well. We see how characters' obsession with money doesn't lead them down the right path. I also wanted to return to respectability and Bradley Headstone because I basically feel like one of the great reasons why Bradley Headstone like breaks over the course of the book and ends up, you know, trying to murder someone. I think it is because he's sort of so tightly bound up in respectability that the moment he breaks slightly out of the respectability, he goes like full criminal and completely like puts aside all moral social codes because he has been so like respectable beforehand and has placed so much value on his respectability that the moment there is like one crack in that, he just can't hold himself together. And I feel like respectability in Bradley Headstone is fascinating. Like, I could write a whole long essay about respectability in Our Mutual Friend and how it relates to Bradley Headstone as a character, and actually how it relates to Charlie Hexam too, because Charlie Hexam like throws off his sister in the name of respectability, throws off Bradley Headstone in the name of respectability, goes on to become super respectable. But he's also like given up on everyone from his past, and like what a lonely life that respectable life of his must be. I mean, he should give up on Bradley Headstone. Bradley Headstone is not a great guy, but he, you know, he should go and apologise to Lizzie. My one gripe with the adaptation, London Tide, was that it had far too sympathetic a portrayal of Charlie Hexam. Charlie Hexam is not a good person. I also wanted to talk a bit about marriage in Our Mutual Friend and how it's portrayed. I think there's quite a lot of interesting things about sort of the marriage market and the idea of marriage as a bargain and how sort of problematic that is. You know, Bella hates the fact that she was left to John Harmon in a will. There's a great bit where after John Rokesmith, actually John Harmon, of course, I can say that now, it's the spoiler-free section, I don't have to pretend that he's dead. When John proposes to her the first time, she says, "And was it not enough that I should have been willed away like a horse or a dog or a bird? But must you too begin to dispose of me in your mind and speculate in me as soon as I had ceased to be the talk and the laugh of the town? Am I forever to be made the property of strangers?" And I love this speech of Bella's because it's so powerful and it shows her anger and also like the ridiculous and unfair position of women within Victorian society. You know, the fact that Bella has just been considered the property of other people and hasn't had that control over her own life. And then we also have this bit later where Mrs. Lamley and Bella are talking, and Sophronia says, "It would not be very easy to find a man worthy of your attractions." And Bella says, "The question is not a man, my dear, but an establishment." And this idea of marriage as a bargain, you know, Bella's talking about finding a man who is wealthy and marrying his establishment more than him. Doesn't matter who the person is, she just wants money at this stage. And this kind of look at marriage as this, you know, a market, a place where everything is about money as well, and how money corrupts marriage as money corrupts everything. Like, that's really interesting too. And throughout the book, we have various kind of depictions of marriages. We have a positive marriage in Mr. and Mrs. Boffin, and then we have a negative marriage, a bad marriage in Mr. and Mrs. Lamley, and a bad one of a very different kind in Mr. and Mrs. Wilfer. Their marriage is bad in a less sinister way. Neither of them seem very happy, but I don't feel like any of them are in danger, whereas sometimes when I read about Mr. and Mrs. Lamley, I do kind of think that they're gonna like go off together to adventure on the continent and he's gonna like be absolutely horrible to her. And then, you know, we have the two marriages towards the end of the novel. We have Bella and John, and we have Lizzie and Eugene. Lizzie and Eugene, obviously they get married right at the end. We don't get to see much of their marriage, but we get to see quite a lot of Bella and John's. And I do feel like that is meant to be very like idealised, this is what a marriage should be like, but he is lying to her quite a lot. I find that plotline really interesting, and the kind of big reveal when he, you know, reveals to Bella that he is actually John Harmon and that Mr. and Mrs. Boffin were, you know, pretending that Mr. Boffin isn't really a bad miser, and they're all happy and they're gonna live together. I feel like that plot point, it slightly stretches believability, and I don't know that it completely works. And it also does feel, you know, patronising to Bella. The fact that John lies to Bella for a very long time about who he is, I don't have a problem with, and I feel like that feels completely believable. And I think especially once they're married, because, you know, she was left to him in a will, and we know that she hated that. Like, you can see that he would be terrified that if he told her who he really was, that would shift their dynamic and their relationship irretrievably. But it bothers me a lot more that the Boffins lie and pretend to her, and that he doesn't tell her that Mr. Boffin wasn't actually a miser, because, you know, then it feels like they've all kind of ganged up on her to play a big trick in order to like teach her to be a better person, and that's like slightly frustrating. I wanted to talk a bit more about gender in the book. I've already spoken a bit about how kind of we have several women who work in the book, which is quite unusual for Dickens, and I think especially people like Miss Abby Potterson and Betty Higdon, who are not working to support their family, because you see quite often in other Dickens novels women who work, but they're working like to support other people. They're not just working to support themselves. And I feel like the independence in Betty Higdon and Abby Potterson are really, really interesting in Our Mutual Friend. And I also feel like the moment where Lizzie saves Eugene from the water after he's been attacked by Bradley Headstone, using like all the physical strength that she has from her manual work rowing, like it's such a fantastic like feminist moment for me. And I think especially because it's such a reversal of the damsel in distress trope. It's really cool that she gets to save him and that he really, really, really needs saving. And the description of the scene as well, and Lizzie's like physical strength and how important that is, bearing in mind like the Victorian idealisation and Dickens's idealisation too often in his books of small physically weak women. Like the fact that Lizzie gets to save the man she loves because she's physically strong, because she used to row a lot, like that's just really cool. I'm gonna read like a page because this is my favourite scene in all of literature, maybe. It's so good. Okay. Her old, bold life and habit instantly inspired her. Without vain waste of breath in crying for help when there was none to hear, she ran towards the spot from which the sounds had come. It lay between her and the bridge, but it was more removed from her than she had thought, the night being so very quiet and sound travelling far with the help of water. At length she reached a part of the green bank, much and newly trodden, where there lay some broken splintered pieces of wood and some torn fragments of clothing. Stooping, she saw that the grass was bloody. Following the drops and smears, she saw that the watery margin of the bank was bloody. Following the current with her eyes, she saw a bloody face turned up towards the moon and drifting away. She was away before it welled up in her mind, away, swift, true, yet steady above all, for without steadiness it could never be done, to the landing place under the willow tree, where she had also seen the boat lying moored among the stakes. A sure touch of her old practised hand, a sure step of her old practised foot, a sure light balance of her body, and she was in the boat. A quick glance of her practised eye showed her, even through the deep dark shadow, the sculls in a rack against the red brick garden wall. Another moment and she had cast off, taking the line with her, and the boat had shot out into the moonlight, and she was rowing down the stream as never other woman rowed on English water. She merely kept the boat before the stream now, and rested on her oars, knowing well that if the face were not visible soon, it had gone down and she would overshoot it. An untrained sight would have never seen by the moonlight what she saw at length a few strokes astern. She saw the drowning figure rise to the surface, slightly struggle, and as if by instinct turn over on its back to float. Just so had she first dimly seen the face which she now dimly saw again. Firm of look and firm of purpose, she intently watched its coming on until it was very near. Then with a touch unshipped her sculls and crept aft in the boat between kneeling and crouching. Once she let the body evade her, not being sure of her grasp. Twice and she had seized it by its bloody hair. It was insensible, if not virtually dead. It was mutilated and streaked the water all about it with dark red streaks. As it could not help itself, it was impossible for her to get it on board. She bent over the stern to secure it with the line, and then the river and its shores rang to the terrible cry she uttered. But, as if possessed by supernatural spirit and strength, she lashed it safe and resumed her seat and rowed in, desperately, for the nearest shallow water where she might run the boat aground. Desperately, but not wildly, for she knew that if she lost distinctness of intention, all was lost and gone. She ran the boat ashore, went into the water, released him from the line, and by main strength lifted him in her arms and laid him in the bottom of the boat. But it's such an amazing scene, and I just can't explain how rare it is for a woman to like do something like that in a Victorian novel. Like it's just awesome. I think that scene, and also the scene where Bradley proposes to Lizzie in the most terrifying way, like I feel like those two scenes are two of the best things Dickens ever wrote. Okay, there was one other theme I wanted to talk about, which I couldn't talk about in the non-spoiler section, and that was kind of like identity and disguise, because we have quite a lot about disguise in this novel. Obviously we have John Harmon, who disguises himself as Julius Hanford and then as John Rokesmith, and who reveals himself to the reader sort of halfway through and then doesn't reveal himself to Bella, you know, who then is his wife until quite late on. John is a really interesting character, and I find his story quite moving. Like everything we know about his childhood and how sort of horrible his father was to him is really interesting. You know, how the Boffins were kind of like the only bright lights in his life. You know, how he comes back to England sort of not knowing who this woman is who his father has pledged him to, and you can understand why he decides that actually he doesn't want to just go back and claim his bride and his fortune. He wants to see who this woman is and see whether or not he might want to marry her. A few people were kind of talking in the Discord server about, you know, do we ever find out why old Mr. Harmon wanted Bella and John to marry? And I think the reason why old John Harmon wanted John to marry Bella is because he hated everyone, including his son, and wanted his son to have a horrible wife. Like the time he decided that he was going to will Bella in a weird way to his son was the time that he walked past and saw Bella hitting her father round the head with her bonnet, and he said, that's a promising girl. And I don't think the implication is that he thought, I like her spirit. I think the implication is that he thought she would lead my son a horrible life and that's what I want for him. That's my theory anyway. And that makes me feel even more sorry for John Rokesmith. Luckily Bella's very nice and they have a happy marriage later and it's all fine. But yeah, I feel like there are so many really sad moments in John's story. After Bella refuses him, when he decides that John Harmon is dead forever and he's just going to be Mr. Rokesmith, there's all this discussion of him like heaping dirt upon himself and like burying himself, and this idea that he sort of had to like repress his whole identity to become someone else because he's been sort of traumatized first by his upbringing and then by his experience of nearly drowning and seeing a dead body in a morgue that was supposed to be him, and how like disconcerting that would be, and how he almost doesn't feel like he's alive. Like I feel like some of that stuff is psychologically fascinating. But we also have a lot of other disguise within the novel. We have Mr. Boffin kind of disguising himself as a miser, pretending that he's not very nice in order to make Bella realise that she's in love with John, and also to undermine Mr. Wegg's schemes to get his hands on Mr. Boffin's money. We also have the Lamleys and all their kind of like social hypocrisy, and also Mrs. Lamley's kind of false friendship with Georgiana that sort of turns into a real friendship. We also have Mr. Ryer and Mr. Fledgeby and all the disguise and pretense that goes on in Pugsby & Co, with Mr. Fledgeby pretending that he is not the proprietor and pretending that it's Mr. Ryer's company in order to protect himself and his reputation, and also basically to use anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jewish moneylenders to make people pay their money on time, which is messed up in so many ways. And there are several scenes where Mr. Fledgeby kind of uses his power over Mr. Ryer to force Mr. Ryer to play a part as well. But that's really interestingly explored, and obviously by the end Mr. Ryer decides that he has had enough of pretense, and obviously by the end Mr. Ryer, you know, breaks with Mr. Fledgeby, decides that the gratitude he has towards Mr. Fledgeby isn't warranted and would not be enough to make up for how horrible Mr. Fledgeby is, and what a horrible position Mr. Fledgeby puts him in a lot of the time. And then we also have kind of like gentler kinds of disguise. So, you know, Jenny Wren, her name isn't actually Jenny Wren, her name is Fanny Cleaver, but she has given herself her own name in order to kind of like take control over her life, and she's given herself a fairy tale name because her life is unhappy, and I feel like that is both like tragic and kind of powerful. Like, go Jenny. I love Jenny Wren, she's the best. I wanted to talk a bit about the plot in spoilery terms. There's so much that I love about the plot. I feel like there are so many great subplots, like the Lamleys and Fledgeby and Betty Higdon, Orphan Johnny. Like, there's so many smaller elements of the story that I find really moving and powerful and really interesting or funny. You know, there's so many great humorous moments too. Like, I feel like the plot is so good. I like the Mr. Wegg and Venus plot as well. Like, I don't think it is as strong as some of the other plots, but I think it's a good like counterweight for some of the other plots. I wanted to talk a bit about Bella's character arc because I really love Bella as a character. I think when I first read Our Mutual Friend when I was a teenager, I think it was Bella who I found like the more exciting character, and I feel like now I'm older, it's Lizzie Hexam who I find the more exciting character, but I do really like both of them, and I feel like Bella has quite an interesting arc. I do think that her arc is slightly complicated by that, you know, messy moment near the end, which I think can be a bit frustrating for a lot of readers. You know, the fact that her character arc has sort of been like tricked out of her by Mr. Boffin pretending to be a miser and Mrs. Boffin and John kind of going along with it. Like, it feels like a fraud and a betrayal that she should be at least a little bit angry about, but also I feel like it slightly lessens her character arc. And also, like, I love the scene where Mr. Boffin says that he's going to see Bella righted and then like shouts at John Rokesmith and like goes slightly mad. I think that scene is so good, but it is really undercut if you know it's a lie. But I also love Mr. Boffin, so I'm also glad that he's not a bad person. And, you know, on the one hand, it's frustrating that Bella has to be like lied to and deceived in order to have her character arc and her character growth, but like Eugene Rayburn has to be nearly murdered. So I feel like the fact that there are two characters who kind of have to experience something not very nice to become better people, like, I feel like the fact that there's one man and one woman having that experience makes it less bad. And I also feel like, on the one hand, it feels quite sort of patronising and sexist that Bella, you know, has her life arranged for her by other people, but I also feel like there's also like a generational element there too. You know, there are at least two other earlier Dickens books where older characters kind of arrange everything for younger characters, or lie to younger characters in order to help them understand themselves better, or that kind of thing. Like, we've seen that before in other Dickens books with older characters doing this kind of thing sort of to younger characters, younger male characters often. So in that sense, I feel like it's an age thing, not just the gender thing with Bella, and that sort of makes me make my peace a bit more. But I do just kind of wish that she was angry, or that John was a bit more apologetic. I feel like if there were like 5 more lines in that scene where Bella was like, I'm really cross, and then forgave them, I feel like that would make it better. But anyway, I want to talk about the 2 best elements of the plot. So one is Bradley Headstone. Like, as I've said before, I think Bradley Headstone is an amazing character, and I feel like his whole arc, his descent into chaos, his sort of intense proposal to Lizzie, his sort of like tragic hero demise into becoming a would-be murderer, like, it's so well drawn and it's so amazingly written and it's believable, and I both sort of hate him and also feel sorry for him, and I think it's really well done. I want to read you his proposal speech to Lizzie because I think it is one of the most like sinister and powerful things ever written. You know what I'm going to say. I love you. What other men may mean when they use that expression, I cannot tell. What I mean is that I am under the influence of some tremendous attraction which I have resisted in vain and which overmasters me. You could draw me to fire, you could draw me to water, you could draw me to the gallows, you could draw me to any death, you could draw me to anything I have most avoided, you could draw me to any exposure and disgrace. This and the confusion of my thoughts so that I am fit for nothing is what I mean by you being the ruin of me. But if you would return a favourable answer to my offer of marriage, you could draw me to any good, every good with equal force. My circumstances are quite easy, and you would want for nothing. My reputation stands quite high and would be a shield for yours. If you saw me at my work, able to do it well and respected in it, you might even come to take a sort of pride in me. I would try hard that you should. Whatever considerations I may have thought of against this offer, I have conquered, and I make it with all my heart. I only add that if it is any claim on you to be in earnest, I am in thorough, dreadful earnest. And the whole of that scene is just so well drawn, and I feel like him as a character and his interactions with Lizzie are just fantastically drawn. You know, his attempted murder of Eugene and how it utterly destroys him when Eugene not only survives but then marries Lizzie. He knows that through his action he has brought them together, and then the fact that Eugene spares Bradley Headstone on purpose to save Lizzie's reputation, this torments him even more. And then his ending after Riderhood has tried to blackmail him is just like so amazingly drawn. I'm going to read a bit from here too because I think it's just fantastic. Bradley had caught him round the body. He seemed to be girdled with an iron ring. They were on the brink of the lock, about midway between the 2 sets of the gate. Let go, said Riderhood, or I'll get my knife and slash you wherever I can cut you. Let go. Bradley was drawing to the lock edge. Riderhood was drawing away from it. It was a strong grapple and a fierce struggle, arm and leg. Bradley got round him with his back to the lock and still worked him backward. Let go, said Riderhood. Stop. What are you trying at? You can't drown me. Ain't I told you that the man has come back from drowning can never be drowned? I can't be drowned. I can be, returned Bradley in a desperate, clenched voice. I am resolved to be. I'll hold you living and I'll hold you dead. Come down. Oh, it's so good. I want to talk a bit about Lizzie and Eugene and their kind of love story, because I feel like that is done very, very well as well. And his kind of character arc and character growth is really interesting, because I feel like it is a very believable relationship and dynamic. Like, I feel like Dickens does a good job of like not over romanticizing Eugene as a character. Like, he is not necessarily a great man. He is a gentleman, an upper class man who meets this working class woman, falls in love with her, but doesn't really understand his own feelings, and also, you know, is aware of the social codes and social rules, and isn't willing to depart from them. And, you know, the way he pursues her and finds her is not kind. Eugene Rayburn is not a kind person, at least for quite a lot of the book. And I love that final scene between them before he is attacked by Bradley Headstone, when they talk and he maybe understands and comes to value her more, and then after they part, there's this bit where Eugene says to himself, out of the question to marry her and out of the question to leave her, the crisis. He's so believable and so dislikable in many ways, but also you do like him. I like Eugene, and I feel like one of the reasons why I like him is because of his like wild similes and some of the strange things he says, but also because he is changed by his experience. Bradley Headstone nearly kills him and Lizzie saves his life, and he recovers to understand himself better, to understand and respect Lizzie more, and to want to marry her. And after they get married, there's this great bit very near the end where him and Mortimer are talking about society, and Mortimer basically is saying, like, aren't you a bit uncomfortable that you've married someone with a very different social background to you? And Eugene says, Now, my wife is something nearer to my heart, Mortimer, than Lady Tippins is, and I owe her a little more than I owe to Tippins, and I am rather prouder of her than I ever was of Tippins. Therefore, I will fight it out to the last gasp, with her and for her, here in the open field. When I hide her, or strike for her faint-heartedly in a hole or a corner, tell me what I shall most righteously deserve to be told, that she would have done well to turn me over with her foot that night when I lay bleeding to death, and spat in my dastard face. Like, I just think that's such an amazing, great speech of Eugene at the end, where he is like, no, I don't actually care what society thinks. Eugene learns to disregard what society thinks, and learns to know himself better, and to know that if he wants to be worthy of Lizzie, he must be a better person, and he's trying to be a better person. And I just think his arc works really well. Anyway, I feel like I've been talking about Our Mutual Friend for a really, really long time. I just think that it's the best book ever, as I've said, and it's so good, and I think everyone should read it, and, you know, I just love it a lot, and it was such a joy to reread it for the Mega Dickens Readalong, and the Mega Dickens Readalong in general has been such a joy. So that's all for now. I will have a video up about Edwin Drood very soon, and a big ranking of all the Dickens' books very soon. Otherwise, let me know down in the comments what you thought of Our Mutual Friend. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.